everyone. Welcome. My name is Aslihan Bulut, and on behalf of the HLS Library, I would like to thank you all for coming to today's luncheon talk for discussion of Professor Moyne's new book, Christian Human Rights. I would like to also thank the Dean's Office for today's lunch, and I encourage you all to enjoy the refreshments while you listen to today's discussion. Just as a quick note, today's talk will be taped, so please note that if you ask any questions at the end of the talk, they will be part of the recording. Professor Moyne is Professor of Law and History at Harvard University. His areas of interest include international law, human rights, the law of war, and legal thought in both historical and current perspective. In intellectual history, he has worked on a diverse range of subjects, especially 20th century European moral and political theory. Professor Gerald Newman is the J. Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International, Foreign, and Comparative Law, and the co-director of the Human Rights Program at HLS. From 2011 to 2014, he was a member of the Human Rights Committee, the treaty body that monitors compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Professor Charles Mayer, it's running just a little bit late, is the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Council on Foreign Relations and a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And Professor Michael Ignatieff is the Edward R. Murrow Professor of Practice at Harvard Kennedy School. He's a Canadian writer, teacher, and former politician. He served in the Parliament of Canada and was leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Just one other announcement. Coop is in the corner selling copies of the book, and Professor Moyne will sign the copies in his office during office hours because he's going to be running off to class right after the talk. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our esteemed panel. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you all for coming, even though this session is not about Justice Scalia's legacy. I'd also like to thank June Casey and the library staff for proposing this session and organizing it. Not least, I'd like to thank the panelists. I've looked up to each of them in various ways for so many years, but it's also true that I suggested their names because I thought they would disagree with the book and therefore make this session more interesting. So this book, Christian Human Rights, is actually a book of essays, and it's concentrated on human rights in the 1940s. That's the era when we get the UN Charter. This is an archival photo of the preamble with dignity, the word dignity actually being written into it. And it's, of course, the era when we get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with its commitment to the dignity of the person and the rights that follow from that dignity. Now, in prior work to this book, I've argued that we should probably, on balance, pay less attention to the 1940s for reasons this new Google data I'm showing you suggests. This is a Google product that lets us measure the comparative salience of words, phrases, and names across time. And the striking fact is that our ancestors in the 40s seem to have bypassed human rights rather than get excited about them. They seem to have been mainly interested in other things. But in this new book, Christian Human Rights, I'm saying that if we are going to dwell on the 1940s, we have to make more room for Christianity, and especially for self-consciously Christian political projects than we have so far, rather than see human rights as just preparation for our current political causes, and of course, legal projects amongst them. So I don't think it ought to be surprising that Christianity was of great significance in the 1940s with respect to the birth of these norms. More than 80% of the original members of the United Nations were Christian majority states, and that total was nearly the same in December 1948 when the UDHR was voted through. But actually, in the book, I don't pay much attention to that universal level of the United Nations, because there were indeed lots of different kinds of players there. Instead, I look somewhere else, mainly at the Western European area and to some extent the transatlantic scene, because that's where the most powerful states were located, and that's where it often mattered to politicians and citizens to find the right kind of Christian politics in an anxious time. So the main argument of the book is that for a great many actors back then, human dignity and rights were not exactly the secular progressive idea that we tend to think when we hear about human rights today. But I try to argue that, in fact, many proponents of human rights were religious and conservative. And more precisely, the book tries to argue that human rights often function to help save religious conservatism from its far-right mistakes. And conversely, the reformulation of conservatism in this era helped move rights to an identifiably center-right politics. Now, to make this admittedly counterintuitive and I hope provocative argument, I look across the book at a number of once prominent individuals. These are some of them on the slide, but I'm not going to identify them or tell you who they were. Instead, I'm going to summarize the approach by saying that I try to connect human rights to the two main events in the 40s in the transatlantic zone, both of which I think had prominent Christian aspects. So first, there was the rise of Christian democracy in the form of new kinds of victorious political parties, which came to dominate much of Western Europe for decades. And then there was the crystallization of a Cold War posture transatlantically, whose proponents often interpreted it as a struggle of Christian democracy for survival. And human rights were understood to be part of that cause. Ultimately, my proposition in the book is pretty simple. We should connect human rights in this era to the main events of the era, rather than view them just as a dry run for us, especially if we locate ourselves on the secular, progressive side of things today. We shouldn't surgically extract human rights from the crucible of their time, even if today, since the 70s and especially 90s, we use human rights for very different purposes in our different crucible. So along the way, I do acknowledge that human rights in the 40s were a response to the past, but it's not so much, or not really much at all, the past of Holocaust atrocity, as many, like Michael, have argued. Instead, I think the best way to think about the relation of human rights to the past in the 40s was a past of conservatism that had gone badly awry just a few years before and now needed to reclaim its bearings. So for that reason, I try to show that we can't understand Christian politics so important in the rhetoric of human dignity and rights without what a lot of historians today call a trans-war approach. It looks at the post-war without forgetting not only the war, but the period before the war, the 30s, in order to understand what actors were doing then, before they experienced the confusions of the war and embraced human dignity and rights afterwards. And as you probably know, sadly in the 1930s, many Europeans were choosing far-right options. And this included, although we often forget, Christian forms of authoritarianism. And in fact, more and more chose that option during World War II itself. So if that's true, the 1940s embrace of human rights may have been a way of processing or even forgetting past mistakes, not mourning victims, as we might like to think today. So with that 1930s background in place, and that's much of what the book does is look back then, it's easier to see human rights as a kind of course correction by conservatives. Not for everyone, but for many, these ideas of human rights and human dignity more specifically are helpfully understood as part of the creation of a center-right politics. The far right has been taken off the table as an option by the war outside the Iberian Peninsula for 30 years. And on the left, socialist and communist politics loom large. So to make these arguments, I actually proceed in a very literal-minded way. First, I try to look at who was for the idea of human dignity, who placed it in important legal documents, first of all, national constitutions. And then I look at the concept of the person. Both these concepts, dignity and the so-called human person, were consecrated in the founding documents of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration, and in other non-international legal documents. I also look at different kinds of Christians, including Catholics and Protestants, although I think in the end what's most interesting about this era for historians of Europe is that these two groups are starting to get along after centuries of strife, including in new formations like the German Christian Democratic Party. And the same people are also inventing the notion of Judeo-Christianity too. What were the main goals in this invention of center-right politics? Well, like us, Christian proponents of human rights wanted to keep their own states in proper bounds. Like us, they understood human rights to be about the promotion of justice. And like us, they wanted to believe that justice involves some crucial norms of personal freedom. But otherwise, I think the proponents of human rights in Christian politics were very different than many current human rights advocates. For one thing, the Christians in my book were most interested in order, not freedom, and in particular fitting together personal freedom outside the state with the moral community of churches and societies. These Christians, to the best of my evidence, were not notably focused on atrocity and almost never on foreign suffering as the central issue human rights are supposed to pick out, except sometimes the suffering of Christians suffering under Soviet rule. These Christians also did not found newfangled NGOs. After all, they had their old ones called churches. And it was in the name of those churches and the larger Christian communities that needed shelter from the state that human rights became important principles. Now, later, everything changed, and I want to insist on that last element of my argument. The 1940s and 50s were institutional Christianity's last golden age in its old European homeland. Meanwhile, the secular left, which was not mainly focused on human rights, but instead on building socialism in the 1940s, reoriented. And so we have a big reversal. Today, I believe it's fair to say, generalizing, that though Christian promotion of human rights is not absent, it is not dominant anymore. Rather, human rights have indeed become a project of the secular progressives. So why bother with history unless you happen to be, professionally interested in it, like Charlie and me? Well, my own main reason is to learn that in spite of what a lot of people have said about the 1940s, human rights don't come from on high. And human beings have defined their core values in lots of different ways, and in the 1940s defined human rights very differently than we do now, which itself means that human rights as a project were redefined in the meantime. And that, of course, means that human rights are open to future redefinition. And we can redefine them too in whatever way we may think best. So thank you very much, and turn to Jerry and the other commentators. It doesn't really matter.
Okay. Thank you. This is a really valuable and fascinating book about the background of the foundation of human rights in the 1940s. It calls attention to a neglected strand in that history, the theory of personalism, which helps account for some of the vocabulary and phrasings used in the early human rights instruments. It provides an important corrective to presentism, the tendency to look back at documents and events of the past through the lens of our current understandings and debates. If you read the book, then you will read the debates over the Universal Declaration and the Covenants and the European Convention with a different eye to what some of the speakers really had in mind. This is a very valuable achievement. I think, though, that the book tells us more about how human rights law came to be than it tells us about what human rights law is. The ideas that are so well described here fed into a political process. The political process produced texts. The texts fed into more debates over the years. And we have left some of the questions of the 1940s behind. As an example, let me say that the European Convention on Human Rights was definitely drafted by Western Europeans. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted in the UN more broadly with the participation of the Soviet bloc, even if the Soviets in the end abstained from the vote on the adoption of the Universal Declaration. Human rights law is not primarily an originalist enterprise, and I don't think a better understanding of the intellectual climate of the 1940s will lead human rights institutions or advocates to change their interpretation of rights. One of the points made in the book is how central religious freedom was to some of the thinkers described in the book, including some who were active at the political level. And I agree that religious freedom is still an important right. And I also agree that a fundamental choice was made and implemented in the text to protect conversion and to protect missionaries. This was divisive then, and it continues to be divisive now. On the other hand, I don't think that any serious account of religious freedom could leave room for the execution or imprisonment of people who convert from one religion to another. So I don't think that the actual history brought us to a different point than we would have reached for different reasons if we were going to have some genuine protection of religious freedom. I'm less persuaded by the argument in the fourth chapter of the book that tries to link the history of the 1940s with the current case law of the European Court of Human Rights, which provides insufficient protection for the practices of Muslim minorities. As Professor Moyne himself says, it has turned out, contrary to the expectations of some of the thinkers that he describes, that religious freedom has in general been underprotected by the European Court of Human Rights. The human rights instruments do not demand total separation of church and state or any particular relation between church and state. And the right to religious practice was not drafted as an absolute right. I think that the European Court of Human Rights sees the variation in religious views and anti-religious views as a source of social conflict. And it tends to be deferential towards states' efforts to manage that conflict. I would put more emphasis on the role played by the margin of appreciation doctrine in the European Court of Human Rights case law, and especially in the aspect of that doctrine that looks for a European consensus before it narrows the state's discretion. That methodology has led to the underprotection of minority practices in religious matters in general in European case law, and that has consequences for non-Christian practices. I say this not to justify it. I say this having served as a member of a different human rights body that does not endorse the margin of appreciation doctrine and that more strongly protects minority religions. In fact, that has disagreed, finding violations on cases that had previously been rejected by the European Court of Human Rights. But I'm not persuaded that the weaker protection at the European level can be explained as a result of the history that Professor Moyne so brilliantly illuminates in this book. Thank you.
I won't summarize what I learned because I learned a lot. European human rights discourse emerges as a part of a Christian democratic conservative restoration directed forward at the anti-religious communist menace and backwards at fascism. And the European Convention is designed to keep Italy and Germany from backsliding. So European human rights has this very important support of the British Conservatives, the Adenauer CDU, and de Gasperi Christian Democrats. And that seems to me a really important contribution to our understanding of how we got European human rights. And the roots of this are laid in the papal encyclicals of the 1930s and the Irish Constitution in 1937, and then some of the philosophical work done by Jacques Maritain. The point I would like to draw out is that this tradition is anti-capitalist, anti-individualist, anti-liberal, and anti-statist. And it's part of a much, then going back much further, hostility to the liberal democratic project going back to 1789 and 1848. There's a long backstory here of Christian conservative reaction to, liberal modernity. And I think that's what makes this so piquant and interesting, is that human rights is not the terminus ad quem of, the 1789 and 1848 project. It may be the counter reaction against it. And that's kind of, Sam's been doing these provocations for 30 years, and God bless him for it. It certainly makes you think. But it raises an issue, and I guess that's kind of question one for Sam, which is, so how does this doctrine, this conservative, restorative, reactionary doctrine, make common cause with the other strands that go into the making of the UDHR? Because I don't think he's claiming human rights is Christian human rights. Sam's claiming Christian human rights are extremely important, forgotten tradition in the genesis of modern human rights, but modern human rights is a confluence of a bunch of traditions that include, dear old Eleanor Roosevelt, the Four Freedoms, those kind of liberal, that American strain, Scandinavian social democracy, some of the Labour Party progressives, and most importantly here, I think, the Central European constitutional lawyers who happen to be Jewish. Lemkin, Lauterpacht, all these guys are coming from another tradition which is not religious, not anti-religious, not Jewish, but the fact that they're Jewish turns out to be important because they lose all their family in the Holocaust, right? So then the question becomes, okay, how does the Christian human rights tradition fuse with these other traditions in 48? Maritain has the famous answer, which is, we all know we have human rights, we just agree to disagree about why we have them, right? So then the fusion is a kind of proceduralist move in which a lot of traditions come together in the making of the UDHR. but it's a very unstable alliance because it's basically we agree to disagree about why we're here. We know we need them, but we don't agree as to why they're here. Is it because of the sacredness of the human person? Is it because, all the other reasons that you might believe in human rights? Is it simply a bracketing operation, as philosophers would say, that gets this confluence? I think the book is not clear about how the fusion and blending of these traditions becomes possible in 1948. The second thing I would say relates to an uncertainty I have in the book about what it's saying is the Christian analysis of fascism. I mean, there are two kinds of analyses you could have. One of them is that fascism is totalitarian authoritarianism, and that's what's wrong with it. That is too much state power, right? Or it could be that fascism is exterminatory nihilism, which is a different claim. It's the claim that you not merely have too much state power, but you use it to wipe out all kinds of human beings. And you do so in a way that is, for liberals, a catastrophe. For Christians, a sense that the cardinal sin here is a deep moral neglect of what is sacred about the human person. And I'm not clear in the book what the Christian analysis of fascism is. You said in your presentation what they're doing is trying to clear up the far right, the Christian flirtation with the far right. They're trying to deal with the embarrassment of Catholic collaboration with Vichy, Catholic collaboration with in Slovakia, some pretty bad stuff. But there always was in the Christian reaction to the Nazis a very early understanding this is not just totalitarianism, this was exterminatory. And exterminatory, the hour of glory in the Christian tradition in the 30s in Germany is to protest against the Nazi euthanasia in relation to the disabled and other persons. Very early on, the Christians are among the first to say, wait a minute, this isn't just state power, this is an exterminatory project. And the reason the question of what they think fascism is important is that, it's consistent with your other book. You say, look, the Holocaust has nothing to do with this, that's presentism. Okay, I get that. I get the fact that your generation's understanding of the Holocaust is a product not of the 40s, but much more of the 60s and 70s. It's, for my generation, I'm much older than you, it's Le Chagrin et la Pitié, it's Lanzmann's Shoah, it's Primo Levi, stuff that gets written and published, and wonderful films, wonderful stuff, in which you become aware of the horror of the Holocaust in the 70s and 80s, and that's a tremendous driver of modern human rights consciousness, the never again stuff. Now it's never again and again and again, but forget about it. But the idea that the Holocaust becomes structuring of human rights only in the 60s and 70s is premised on a kind of return of the repressed. And the premise is that it's all repressed in the 40s. And I'm not convinced that you get away with that, to be blunt, in this book, because I think that your Guy Ritter, this historian of human rights, he comes out of Ravensbrück. He comes out of Ravensbrück because he's arrested for the 1944 plot. Well, you got to be really deaf, dumb, and blind to come out of Ravensbrück and not know what was going on at Ravensbrück next door. And you got to be semi-deaf, dumb, and blind as a German constitutional lawyer of any even awareness of the world, not to be aware of what Dachau and Buchenwald looked like in 1945. And the reason you really are deaf, dumb, blind if you don't see it is that the occupation authorities are putting up posters to show you. I mean, Werner Soller's work on this is quite interesting. The idea that the Germans didn't really know anything about this till the trials of the 60s, I don't think is convincing after you see just how much there was. So then there's a question about method, because the method of the book, and you've done it superbly well, and I don't want to criticize anybody who's an intellectual historian who pays the serious attention you do to text you know, if it isn't in the text, it's not a driver of a thought, is what you're saying. You know, show me where dignity comes from. Okay, it comes from the papal encyclicals. Show me whether the Holocaust figures in the text. If it isn't in the text, I'm not buying. Okay, but that's a curiously airless, library-driven kind of academic view of how intellectual life gets shaped. I mean, these people are living in a world where they're, you know, Jews are fleeing to Palestine. You got IDPs all over the roads. Germany's in chaos. What are they seeing when they see this? Your claim is what they're seeing is simply excessive authoritarianism. I'm claiming they are also seeing this was an exterminatory project. And precisely the power of the Christian critique of Nazism was that it was an assault on the human person, on its essential dignity. And that captures, I mean, the reason I'm going on about this is that it captures something that the liberal critique didn't catch. I mean, the liberal story is what liberals worry about fascism is that the Weimar Constitution didn't stop Hitler from destroying everything. The rule of law proved to be pathetically unequal to the task. The Christians would go further and say there was some deeper disease and sickness in the human soul that would lead, you know, all these fancy, educated people to prosecute an exterminatory project. But you're saying the Christians don't go there. And I'm saying, well, that was precisely the power of the Christian critique of Nazism. It's actually stronger than, you know, I'm an old, you know, Adlai Stevenson, Eleanor Roosevelt liberal. But my side didn't see that, the horror. And sometimes you're saying, I guess you're telling me the Christians didn't see it either. And I'm just not convinced. So those are two questions. The question is, how do they make common cause with the people who weren't Christians who built the human rights edifice after 48? And secondly, what was their analysis of fascism?
Some of what I say will overlap with Michael's. This is a very challenging book. We have been engaged as historians, not I personally, but Sam is one of the major ones in the reinterpretation of the history of human rights, also of international law, which we find in unlikely sources such as the Tsar of Russia's wanting to sponsor the Geneva Conventions at the turn of the 20th century. The thesis has been expounded by the others. Conservative human rights. What I would have liked, I really liked this book a lot, but I was challenged, and I do have some questions. So I will bring up some of what I would have liked to have seen more. And I would have liked actually to have seen a little more in theology. You talk about personalism, you talk about maritime, but you know this. What he's doing is you're obviously quite aware of this, you know, is bringing out a Thomistic, neo-scholastic project. That is, God, as St. Thomas said, you know, is implanted within us reason, and in that sense, we share in this little aspect and imperfectly in what divinity is, and it's a doctrine which you can trace back, and you mentioned this to Stoics on a secular level, but it's clearly a scholastic revival, and I think it deserved a little more exposition. I also, you know, the Protestant side of this, if we're doing theology, what was not in the book, and I was surprised at, was the German Protestant church is split into you know, those who supported the Hitler project, the Nazi project, and those who withdrew, the confessional churches as they were called. And the theology of Karl Barth and the reinterpretation built around the notion of Romans, the letter to the Romans, and to what extent you submit to authority, don't authority. I think that doesn't institutionally feed in, but I do think if we're doing this story, we have to ask about that contribution, as well as Ritter, who is not a theologian. It's clear, you know, the Catholic attitude in the 19th century, at the time the Church was busy condemning liberalism and the syllabus of errors, was that expressed rather cynically by Louis Veuillot, a Catholic apologist in the Second Empire, who said, we demand liberty of conscience so we can deny it to others. Okay, I'm not going to tax Catholics with that, because obviously this was overtaken, and Sam's story is a story of that overtaking. But I guess in a sense, here's where I come to what Michael said. This is a book in retrieval. I mean, it's a method of you retrieve ideas. So you look for the ideas, and you say they're important, and they are important. Justice Scalia perhaps retrieved ideas, but ideas are always there in context. I mean, Sam, of course, understands this, and he's saying, let's look at the context. But he's looking, I think, at a partial context, and this is, I guess, for someone who's even older than Michael. I had a birthday yesterday. It was appalling, but it's. I remember some of these contexts. Gerhard Ritter, who wrote a major essay on Nazism in 1950. It was published early then in a UNESCO volume, in which he said essentially Nazism is a deformation of the French Revolution. It is the result of an excessive democracy. So here's a man who is retrieving liberty of conscience, but at the same time placing it in a context which is as important for his readers as the doctrine itself. And I think this is, I guess, the contextual notion. I mean, we know we can look at David Kurtz's recent book on Pius XI. These are popes deeply imbricated, maybe helplessly so, in the fascist project as such. I mean, Pius XII loved Germany. He was a long-time nuncio there. He did not, and his decision has been defended, and I don't mean to raise it here, did not raise his voice about Jews as such. The Christian project doesn't, because he says, we all have this divine spark, it is not able to target particular victims of violations of human rights. And I think this is one of its difficulties. There's no capacity in this project as it emerged in the 40s to be able to say, look, we've had this glaring thing. So, I mean, it strikes me, resurrecting the states of Western Europe are to be built on a Christian democratic project. But no one bothered to say to what extent Jews were involved in that. Ultimately, they came in, it was Judeo-Christian, there's this nice merger. I mean, Sam is very generous, and he cites my book and its interpretation. He says, I overlooked, or if you extended my analysis of the Second World War, you would not be able to see the Christian input into it. And I agree with him, and I said this, Christian democracy is really the political novum of the post-war period, and it's tremendously important in bringing back former quasi-fascists into an acceptable conservative fold. I agree with him on the implications. I guess I would, I do find the French preoccupation with headscarves and insignia. They justified on the basis of the achievements and the necessity of the French Revolution, but it's become dysfunctional. If you want a great read on that, take Orhan Pamuk's Snow and read the dialogue that the Islamist comes to a secular school principal who he will shoot because the secular school principal, being a good Kemalist, does not allow a headscarf being worn. It's a fantastic dialogue. It's worth reading. So my sense, again, I'd like a little more on the theology. I guess, my sense of history is I'm less preoccupied with retrieval, though I think it's important to understand this, and more concerned about context and overall placement of ideas. One would not know anything, and you'll say, well, I didn't intend it. One would not know anything about the record of the church. Its ambiguous record, let's say, because it did stand up about euthanasia, but that was what they stood up for. That was where the bishops were courageous in denouncing this project, and I'm immensely grateful to this church, and I still think of these guys whenever I have hesitancies about, voluntary rights of the Seattle or Washington legislation or the Dutch legislation. This is a large stream, and I guess I would have liked to have, I would critique the book only on this grounds. On the other hand, I think the service of the book is immense. It does remind us we have to go back to sources of rights and liberties, which many of us in a profoundly secular society. I was brought up in one. I even went to a campaign lunch for Adlai Stevenson as a teenager. It's always a question of balance. So I'm grateful for this book, and I guess, but it is part of a debate, I think, and that's important. And even today, when we ask about these things, I think the resolution. I think it's pretty easy to speak up for headscarves. I don't know what I think of the evangelical intrusion into American politics today. We're watching its effects. I don't know what I think of any religious intrusion into politics, because if this human rights were not a secular project, it's clear that some aspects of secularism had to be encompassed within a more general human rights agenda.
All right. Well, since we have time, maybe I'll say a few words in response to these wonderful comments, and then you're welcome to say your piece. So I want to entirely agree with all the comments, but especially with Professor Newman's. I'll come back to the headscarf cases and explain what I argue about them later. But he's surely right to reject originalism. Even though there's another panel where I think they're probably talking a lot about it and its merits. For professional historians, there's a great wariness about returning in a crassly instrumental way to the past. And even more important, as I think Jerry insisted, there's no sense that the original meaning of human rights controls their present form and interpretation. So this is a project that tries to go back to some forgotten origins, but not because I think that they have been controlling or ought to be in the future. It might help us wonder why it is that in the 40s, as you can see perfectly well from this last chart that's still up there, many of us might have been tempted to be side with socialism rather than human rights. And it might get us to wonder why we changed our mind about that. This chart obviously doesn't reflect the Bernie Sanders candidacy. It's too early for that. But otherwise, there's no attempt to argue an originalist politics. Just the reverse. So I come to Michael's very wise intervention. Certainly, it's quite critical to think about how the fusion was possible, especially at the United Nations, where more perspectives and voices were involved. And it seems to have been, with maybe more exclusions than we would like to think, an example of an incompletely theorized agreement for the reasons that Jacques Maritain outlined. And surely that means that human rights and new words introduced into high politics like human dignity had to be the subject of consensus on the part of lots of different folks. Although in the book I try to push back against the notion that human dignity in particular was all things to all people, because it remains quite securely linked for a long time to constitutions in which Christian Democrats have a hand, and that's true down into I think the South African Constitution. And yet your general point is correct. This is a piece of the landscape, I think not just a neglected piece, but maybe the most important piece in the era, but that would have to be argued and demonstrated. I'd like to stand my ground about Christians and the past. Certainly in the 30s, Christians, both Protestants and Catholics, developed the idea and the theory of the totalitarian state. and it was later used by lots of other folks. But they pioneered the worry that in modern times the secular state has the propensity to get out of hand, and we should maybe make more connections than people had done between the fascist version of that and the communist version. I think that is by far the controlling idea within Christian circles. It would be inaccurate to say that no Christians cared about victimhood too. Very rare is it, sadly, to find Christians who care about Jewish victimhood. That's to say, the main victimhood we now remember. I should say that two of the characters so far mentioned did. Jacques Maritain was married to a racial Jew and had to flee here for that reason, and said some very early penetrating things about the importance of the Holocaust. And if we're going to be fair, Gerhard Ritter, the German historian who's been mentioned, this is a Lutheran now, attended Edmund Husserl's funeral in 1938, which was an act of great courage, actually, in the context of the time. His Jewish, again, racially Jewish colleague who had been shunned by others at the university. But even for him, let alone most other Christians, the death of the Jews was sadly not central. And an excellent example of this, if we're interested in euthanasia, is Bishop Clemens von Galen, who was by far the leading critic in Germany on religious grounds of the euthanasia program, and again gave very courageous sermons about it in the late 30s, but was himself a quite bitter anti-Semite and didn't extend his worries about what the Nazi state was doing to the disabled to what it was doing and did to the Jews. More generally, we just can't find that much evidence. And it's not a matter of text, but it's a matter of inferring from silence. We might be tempted to say generously that when Christians referred to the suffering of the period, they meant to include the Holocaust in particular, but it's just, or as plausible, I think more plausible to think that they're evading that set of events. And more generally, I think when we look back, we just are it's staggering, but we find that people were deaf, dumb, and blind. And the moral reality that we've since taught ourselves and others simply was delayed. An excellent example of this would be the Christian Democrat François de Menthon, who gives the opening address at the Nuremberg trials, and is accorded the prosecution of the crimes against humanity charge, and does not mention the Jews in his opening address. And of course, Nuremberg slighted their fate all the way through. I agree with what Charlie said as well. I'll just mention that this book has already been through the ringer. If you look online, there are many more bitter critics of it than these three have turned out to be. And that's interesting, of course. I would say the main criticism is that it maybe gives short shrift not so much to Protestants who were very compromised, much more so in Germany than Catholics, as to Anglo-American Protestants who had their own promotion of human rights. John Foster Dulles, who's one of the white men on the slide, led the way in that regard. And maybe we could generate a kind of richer picture of Christian human rights by looking at those Protestants. It's still these people who brought the world into the Cold War and Christianized it, so I think that's quite important. Maybe I'll close with a comment about the headscarves. It's surely true that the most of the blame, if we're apportioning it, for the outcome of these cases falls on the secularist regimes that have enacted the laws, in France, first of all, and Turkey, if you want to extend the verdict there. And it's also surely right, as Jerry says, that it's the margin of appreciation doctrine that explains doctrinally why the European court is willing not to protect the right at stake to manifest a religion. What I try to argue is something much more minimal, that in a lot of the court's language, it sounds like it's saying that Muslims are a threat to democracy in approximately the same way as communists have been. And according to this famous militant democracy, first of the German Constitutional Court and later the European Court, it's justifiable not to protect rights when it is necessary to preserve a democratic minimum. And so that's the very narrow case that's made in my last chapter, and it suggests that there are some legacies, not dominant legacies, but some in these cases today that deserve to allow us to connect that ancient past and present. So thank you very much. I don't know who's in charge here, but should we proceed to any?
I'd like to entertain a few questions from...
It's up to you, absolutely. And for all of these experts.
Thank you, Sam, as usual. Very, as has been said, provocative. Just two brief points, which anyone may want to respond to or not. First is your doer last chapter. Doer exaggerates the joy in it, I would say, but not forecasting, but definitively pronouncing on the near annihilation of human rights as a powerful force given to rhetoric, deception, all of the very accurate observations that you make. It seems to me that maybe your entire book, I haven't read all of it that carefully, leaves out economic and social rights, which in a sense, despite their impotence in inducing action or policies in many states, I think, in a concrete way, speak much more universally and over time to the human condition than do civil and political. After all, we all need clothing. Isaiah told us to feed the starving and clothe the naked. He didn't say also you should have single-member districts which elect every 4 years, and so on and so forth. So much of civil and political seems to be associated with the development of democracy. I view the entire covenant as the appendages to a notion of political democracy which cannot exist without the realization of most of the rights there, and indeed in two clauses, as we know, specifically requires a participatory form, electoral form of democracy. So the question is, do economic and social rights seriously survive today and escape the statements or wrath of the last chapter? After all, as long as Pope Francis lives, economic and social rights are not dead. And the tradition goes far back, as has been pointed out in encyclicals and other documents over several centuries. So that's one thing. And the other is, briefly, this notion that maybe in the pure speculation, the post-war world and the time of the Universal Declaration, maybe this was also a period of the affirmation of democracy after all the other types had been shown to be evil to the barrel, and the Soviet Union was known to be such even before it went on to prove it more dramatically. So these were the appendages to it. You had to have this. I'd be curious to know if a universal or united declaration of Christian human rights, written in the mid-1940s, totally independently of the UN or all of this stuff, just what it included and what it did not about the kind of rights that have developed around some conception of individualism and participatory democracy.
So Professor Steiner is my former human rights teacher, so I owe him all the deference in the world. I want to say there's a rhetorically experimental epilogue in the book in which I try to compare Christianity and human rights as sort of world historical movements. There's no intent to say that human rights are dead or anything like that. I think there is an interesting question about whether we're at the beginnings of the movement's ascent or whether it's facing real limits that we can't anticipate it overcoming anytime soon. But neither with respect to human rights in general nor with respect to economic and social rights am I a critic. It's quite interesting that as a result of the Cold War, the Western European zone lopped off the second half of the Universal Declaration until it developed another document a bit later. To me, it's quite important that Christian Democrats were welfarists. Where they ruled, they created their own kinds of welfare state, and many of the welfare states that have come to exist in Western Europe are due not to social democrats as in Britain and the Nordic countries, but to Christian Democrats. And so it may be a peculiarity of some aspects of American Christianity that has led to the demotion of those economic and social rights. Notably, as a result of the Cold War, we find, as you know, lots of enthusiasm for economic and social rights in and during World War II. But figures like Dulles, who not only turn on economic and social rights, but on the whole project of human rights, have to be important in explaining why, for Americans, economic and social rights became radioactive. It's an interesting fact that relative to his conservative predecessors, Pope Francis, it's been shown, puts much less emphasis on rights in general. And so when he promotes the cause of the poor or wants us to care about environmental degradation, it's not within a rights framework. Your second question, I think I'll just leave. It's, lots of people have been Democrats into the 20th century, including the far right, alas, but certainly the far left. And so it seems as if we'd have to say that it was widely understood that the Universal Declaration implicated a specifically liberal form of democracy. And fortunately, I think we have a conference about that later in May, so we'll revisit that topic.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, which you bring up in your book, you mentioned cite Marco Durante. In many ways, the European Declaration is an effort by conservatives in part to forestall the agenda of economic rights. They don't like it, and so they put political rights ahead. So it's very ambiguous, and I do think this is where we really need to, what is a right, and how it's going to be defined, because there's no consensus I don't think on much of this. And Francis, yes, the church, the whole notion of charity is as an alternative to rights or to equality, I think has to be borne in mind.
One more?
Okay, sure. Aziz, yeah.
So, the question I had was, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about not just the disjunctures, but what might be the continuities between this 1940s moment with Christian human rights and the 1970s moment that we think of as liberal human rights. And in particular, I was struck by, in a way, the last thing that you said in response to the panel, which is the arguments about militant democracy that take place in Germany during this period, and the ways in which an argument from Christian human rights is being employed to critique forms of dissent that had previously existed on both the right and the left, and to present arguments about really, let's say, democratic involvement in the economy as akin in various ways to the politics of fascism. And so I'm curious about how the shaping of what amounts to a Cold War state during this period ends up having implications for the kinds of arguments that are made in the 70s and the types of both rights claims, maybe this is a continuation of the socioeconomic rights point, but also the terrain of acceptable discourse. So how is this rights language informing what becomes possible as a set of arguments 30 years later? So maybe there is a continuity in some way.
Because of my looming class, I'm going to dodge this one, but it's a fantastic question, and I think the book is sadly focused on human rights, but what it is sort of would like to have been about, or what I would like it to have been about, is the formation of Cold War liberalism, which it has some antecedents, is very nervous about democracy. That goes back to Charlie's points, and has had a significant revival after 9/11 in various ways and in various forms. And so what would be quite interesting is to take a book about human rights as a stepping stone to a kind of broader history of a certain political stance, which is about minimal politics, appeals to human sinfulness as a warning about a democratic disaster, and especially redistributive disaster, and a set of fears about enemies, internal and external, that obviously remain alive and well in the popular imaginary, including in the current presidential campaign. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your coming.